And let me be frank, a tariff is a tax on the American consumer period, end of story. This is going to cause increased costs for average Americans. When 40% of Americans can't handle an emergency, an emergency that costs $400 or more, then when you increase the cost of putting gasoline in your tank to get to work, when you increase the cost of buying summer clothes for your kids or go back to school clothes for the kids, when the cost of food on your table and your groceries increases, when the cold beer you want to drink on a hot summer day increases, these are all things that are going to have an impact on the American consumer. And then it has impact on businesses that create jobs based on imports, right? Ask Toyota, which is a company that manufactures vehicles in my hometown of San Antonio and puts thousands of people to work. You talk to the farmers and ranchers who are going to have a hard time exporting their products. There are more cows than people in the middle part of my district, and about 80% of that gets exported to Mexico. So there is an impact. And ultimately, when you look at, if you're doing this to try to solve the border crisis, the way you solve the border crisis is, number one, don't treat everybody that's coming into our country as an asylum seeker. Not everybody is actually claiming asylum when they first get apprehended, and so we shouldn't be treating them like an asylum seeker, because that increases the amount of time they have to be detained in the United States. What we're dealing with on the border right now is a crisis. There's no question about it. Last month, 109,000 people came in the country illegally. Last year, 400,000 people came into the country illegally. Border Patrol, Customs, ICE, they're overworked. And by the way, guess what? This is a shared problem with Mexico. So their versions of Border Patrol, ICE, and Customs are overworked. The way you deal with this problem is by working together and strengthening our alliances, not by weakening them. I think another step that the administration can take today is to select a special representative, a senior U.S. diplomat for the Northern Triangle. That's El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So we have that senior diplomat working with those three countries, also working with Mexico, working with the rest of the Western Hemisphere on the root causes of this problem, which is violence and lack of economic opportunities in those countries.
I want to ask you, you mentioned asylum. You have a series of reforms to the asylum process that is out right now, and this is really where we're seeing the numbers skyrocket, right? That's why you're addressing this. You say you want migrants who are coming from Mexico or from Canada, but let's focus on Mexico because that's really where the issue is right now. You want them to apply for and to be denied asylum in Mexico before they would be able to seek asylum in the United States. How would that work? You're talking about working with Mexico, but how would that work without just shifting this crisis to Mexico?
So first and foremost, don't treat everybody as an asylum seeker. It's taking about 5 years now for someone to go through our immigration courts in order to address, to deal with asylum.
Congressman, I just want to ask you about this, because the process I'm asking about precedes how you treat them. You're talking about even before you determine how to treat them as an asylum seeker, that they need to go through the process in Mexico and be denied before they could seek. So that's essentially, it's happening then in Mexico before in the U.S.
Or it's happening in Guatemala, or it's happening in countries. So most across the world, the way asylum usually works, right, is that you apply for asylum in the country that is contiguous to the country that you are leaving, and you have to be a member of one of 5 protected classes that is being targeted or harassed, usually by the government. But if it's not by the government, then you have to prove that the government can't protect you or won't protect you against the threat that you're dealing with, right? Those are the reasons that you can apply for asylum. And there are legitimate reasons for that. And when you abuse the asylum system, guess what? The people that really need it, aren't being able to get it. So if you leave your country and the next country you come to, you don't apply for asylum there. Then you come to Mexico, where there is a UN humanitarian camp in Oaxaca that is processing processing people for asylum, and then you try to sneak into our country in between our ports of entry, and you don't apply for asylum when you are getting arrested, and you do it 5 or 6 days after you've been apprehended by Border Patrol, that is someone that is ultimately gaming the system. The way the asylum laws are written now, the individual, apprehending the person and ICE has the ability to take into account the credibility of the individual requesting this, and if they think they're not credible, then they're able to be deported. The other thing that we should be doing, and can be done right now, is increasing the amount of intelligence on the human smugglers that are bringing people from the Northern Triangle to Texas and the rest of the country. To get from Tegucigalpa to El Paso is really hard, but we know these drug trafficking organizations have figured out how to do it. They've invested into buses, and so now a trip that was taking 10 to 15 days is now being done in 4 days. We should be increasing the collection on those groups, working with our partners in those countries, and stopping many of these caravan and these folks that are coming in here before they get to Mexico, before they get to our border. These are some of the steps that can be taken right away.
Intel, obviously, in your background, former CIA. I do want to ask you about our breaking news, which is that the Trump administration is canceling a number of things that unaccompanied minors have had at their disposal. For instance, activities, one of the things noted by the Washington Post was even something like soccer, but we're talking English lessons, and perhaps most significantly is legal advice. You hear HHS ORR, which deals with this, saying, hey, we're just running out of money. But the perception, even by people who run these facilities that handle these minors, is that they're just trying to make it really onerous, and they're trying to make it awful, and that's supposed to dissuade unaccompanied minors. What do you think about this?
Well, any version of family separations or trying to make things worse is not going to stop this problem. You address the root causes, you make sure you're working in an efficient way with your allies to stop this, and you address your own laws. But we do know Department of Homeland Security, HHS, specifically ORR, is indeed going to run out of money sooner rather than later. I attempted to plus up ORR by about $3 billion in order to deal with this. Unfortunately, my Democratic colleagues on the Appropriations Committee prevented that amendment from going through to make sure the people that are dealing with this crisis have the resources that they need. Oh, and by the way, the communities, cities, counties, nonprofit organizations that are dealing with this crisis because the executive branch and the federal government hasn't been able to deal with this, they should be reimbursed for having to take over the responsibility of the federal government. And ultimately, some of the legal advice that is being given to these folks, a lot of that is being done by nonprofit organizations to make sure that people know what their rights are.
I want to ask you very quickly, I'm running out of time here, but before you leave, the president, in order to make this latest move that he wants with the tariffs, the expectation is he would need to declare another emergency. You voted to block the first one.
Sure.
Rand Paul was on here yesterday. He said he thinks there's a veto-proof majority to block it in the Senate. Do you think that's the case in the House?
In the House, I think there is, because I'm pretty sure most of the Democrats would vote against it. I don't know what the veto-proof number would ultimately be. We have a crisis going on right now. There's no question about that. But trying to usurp Congress's power of the purse in order to do something, that is not the way our government ultimately operates. And that separation of powers has been a hallmark of our government for a very long time, and it's what's helped lead us to where we are. So again, tariffs, it's a tax on the American consumer, and we don't need to be going that way. When you look at what's happening with the stock exchange and the markets decreasing, potentially in for a correction, when you look at the fight we're having to deal with China, which is stealing our technology, tariffs is not the way to do that. We should be talking about how can Canada, Mexico, and the United States work together to counter many of these other threats that we're seeing, especially from China. That's the way we should be going.